Hello and welcome back as we start this new section on CSA or Certified Solution Architect concepts. Now, what we're going to do in this section is really tie together a lot of the concepts that we've been talking about and learning throughout this entire course. So this section should be used as a review section, something to really help solidify all of these concepts in your mind before you go and sit for the exam. So for this particular section, we're going to jump into the appendix and then click on CSA concepts. So over the course of the next set of videos, we're going to work through all of these various sections and just talk theoretically about a lot of the different concepts that you really need to understand in order to be a good solutions architect in AWS, as well as do well when you're sitting for the exam. So let's go ahead and start in this particular lesson with how to design cloud services and best practices. So when we're designing cloud services and talking about best practices, the first thing that we always want to remember, and perhaps the most important thing, is that we always want to design for failure and create self-healing application environments. So remember, we want our applications to be highly available, fault-tolerant, elastic, and scalable. These are very important concepts that we always must practice, and whenever we're designing an application, we want to look at each component and say to ourselves, what happens if this component fails? Will it self-heal itself? Do I have to replace it? Do I have to fail over to a standby instance that I have or infrastructure that I have built in a different region? What happens when a component fails, or what happens when the entire application fails? Or even what happens if an entire availability zone or an entire region fails? We always have to be thinking in those terms when designing our applications in AWS. So to that, we always want to design applications with instances in at least 2 availability zones. That is a bare minimum. If you are designing applications with only 1 instance in 1 availability zone, that is not going to provide for high availability and fault tolerance, and it is not following best practice. Also, it is really important that you guarantee that you have reserved capacity in the event of an emergency by purchasing reserved instances in a designated recovery availability zone. Because we have to remember that AWS does not guarantee on-demand instance capacity in any particular availability zone. Now, it may be rare to have that capacity maxed out, but it can happen, especially if an entire availability zone or region were to go down and everyone is going to rush to migrate their infrastructure to a different availability zone or to a different region. It may overrun that particular region or availability zone. So if you have purchased reserved instances set aside in a different availability zone or in a different region, you're guaranteed to have that capacity waiting for you if and when you need it. You also want to rigorously test to find single points of failure and apply high availability. So again, design for failure, but then test that. Manually break certain aspects of your application and see what happens when those components break. Also, you want to take advantage of built-in backup services that are already part of AWS services. So you always want to enable RDS multi-AZ and automated backups because they're there for you. They're there for you to use. It makes things so much simpler by just flipping a switch and having automated backups created for you. You also want to utilize elastic IP addresses for failover to standby instances when autoscaling and load balancing are not available. Also, with things like Route 53, you want to implement failover DNS techniques that include latency-based routing or failover DNS routing. Now, we went over failover DNS quite extensively earlier on in this course, and it's something that you always want to take advantage of because you can easily just fail over from a component that fails to a component that's working using failover policies in Route 53. You also want to always have a disaster recovery and backup strategy that specifically utilizes multiple regions. You want to maintain up-to-date AMIs and copy those AMIs to those other regions that you have saved for failover or for disaster recovery. You want to copy EBS snapshots to other regions, and you can use cron jobs to take snapshots of EBS to automate that process. And you want to automate everything in order to easily redeploy resources in the event of a disaster. Also utilizing bootstrapping to quickly bring up new instances with minimal configuration and allowing for the creation of generic AMIs. You always want to decouple application components using services such as SQS. So again, if one component of your application fails, the other components can continue to work independently of the component that failed. You always want to throw away older broken instances. That's the great thing about using AWS is that you can provision and terminate instances at will. So Why spend time trying to fix or repair a broken EC2 instance when you can just throw it out and create a perfectly new, healthy one in a matter of seconds? You also always want to utilize CloudWatch to monitor infrastructure changes in health. Always utilize multi-part upload for S3 uploads for objects over 100 megabytes. And you also always want to cache static content on Amazon CloudFront using EC2 or S3 as origins. Because if you remember, caching content on CloudFront distributions helps reduce costs and the load that will be placed on your application. You also always want to make sure to protect your data in transit by using HTTPS or SSL endpoints. And you always want to protect data at rest using encrypted file systems or EBS S3 encryption options. Well, always connecting to instances inside of the VPC using a bastion host or VPN connection. Again, these are just added levels of security for your data and for your application. And lastly, use IAM roles on EC2 instances instead of using API keys. And remember to never store API keys on an AMI. That's very important. So that's just a quick summary of really some best practices to follow when designing cloud services. And you really need to understand these fundamental concepts to be a good solution architect in an AWS environment and also to do well on the exam. So make sure that you really review this list and understand these concepts. And if you don't understand any one of these particular concepts, go back and watch the specific videos that cover any of the topics that you may feel weak on that we covered throughout this course. And with that, we will conclude this lesson. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.